May 22, 1933, after spending nearly 9 years behind bars, John Dillinger walks out of the state prison in Michigan City, Indiana. For years his applications for parole were denied. Finally, that May, word came down that a parole had been approved. After almost a decade, Johnny would be coming home. The governor received a letter from the convict's father. His stepmother was dying. If anything could be done to get him home sooner rather than later, it would be appreciated. Nothing was done to speed along the process, and as Dillinger pulled up to the family farm, the undertaker was already there. He missed saying goodbye to his stepmother by mere hours. One more reason to be bitter. Though Johnny, as everyone called him, assures his family and all the town folk, many of whom had written letters to the parole board on his behalf, that he has learned his lesson and is ready to make good. Nothing if farther from the truth. He made his decision before he even left the pen. His life would be one of crime. He is angry and resentful. Society owes him for all the time he did. He was always a bit of a delinquent growing up, but not as bad as others who did worse and got off much easier. He felt that he had been railroaded into prison. On September 6, 1924, the then 21-year-old made a ham-fisted attempt at robbing a local grocery store owner. His confederate was a 31-year-old ne'er-do-well named Ed Singleton. The plan was for Dillinger to slug the proprietor over the head with a large bolt wrapped in a handkerchief and take the day's receipts. If the bolt didn't work, he had a handgun to scare him with. The grocer didn't scare, however, and the boater he was wearing protected his head. The older man yelled for help as he wrestled with the young hoodlum. During the melee, the gun went off and Dillinger ran away empty-handed. The grocer recognized Dillinger and he was arrested the following day at home. The prosecutor assured him that if he would plead guilty, the judge would go easy on him since it was his first offense. The bandit refused. Later his father came in and convinced him to plead guilty, and he agreed. The prosecutor told the elder Dillinger that he didn't need to bother hiring a lawyer for his son. He confirmed that with the guilty plea, he would receive a light sentence. So without a lawyer, or his father who didn't bother showing up, the 21-year-old stood in court alone. He pled guilty as planned but was dumbfounded when the judge handed down a sentence of from 10 to 20 years. As he was hustled off to the reformatory at Pendleton, Indiana, he complained to deaf ears that he was tricked by everyone. His father, the prosecutor, the judge. Already with a chip on his shoulder, when he was being processed, he told the warden that he would escape. Within the first 6 months of his incarceration, he had an additional year added to his sentence for attempted breaks. After this he settled down a bit, and the following spring 2 inmates who would have a life-changing impact on his life were sent to the reformatory. 1. Homer Van Meter was sent inside for his part in a train robbery in which his accomplice was killed. A few months later, Harry Pierpont, called Pete by his friends, was returned to the reformatory. He was first sent there in 1922 at the age of 19 after he shot a guy in an attempted car theft, but managed to get paroled. In the spring of 1925 he took part in a bank robbery in Kokomo, Indiana, and was later arrested in Detroit and sent back to Pendleton. Though Dillinger liked and admired both hoodlums, Pierpont hated Van Meter and would have nothing to do with him. Within a few years both men were transferred to the state penitentiary at Michigan City. Dillinger remained at the reformatory. Though he no doubt missed his pals, he kept busy playing for the reformatory's baseball team. He played for at least the 1928 and 1929 seasons. He played second base the first year and center field the next. All the time trying to get paroled and all the time being denied. In the summer of '29, after yet another denial, he shocked the reformatory authorities by requesting a transfer to the state penitentiary at Michigan City. He claimed that he wanted to go there to play baseball, but it's more likely that he wanted to reconnect with his pals. Arriving at Michigan City, he found that Pierpont had become the head of a small group of hardened convicts, consisting of a number of bank robbers. There was Russell Clark, a veteran of numerous bank jobs. Like Pierpont, he was arrested in Michigan and sent to the pen in '27. Charles Mackley, called Mac, who at 39 was the mature one of the group. He had been inside since 1928. He was the head of his own outfit that knocked over 6 banks before he was captured. Rounding out the group was John Hamilton, a former rum runner originally from Michigan and called Red because of his hair. He was arrested for robbing a bank in South Bend. At first Dillinger wasn't brought into the fold. His best friend was James Jenkins, who was doing life for murder. The two were extremely close. It was thought that Jenkins might have been Dillinger's old lady, prison parlance for sex partner. The two daydreamed about getting out of prison and moving to South America. Jenkins also talked a lot about his sister Mary, and Dillinger became somewhat enthralled with her, especially after Jenkins showed him her picture. At the dawn of the 30s, a few attempts at escape were made by Pierpont, but all failed. It was Mackley who advised that the best way out would be to bribe some guards and have some guns smuggled in. They figured that the best way to go about it would be to have someone from the inside who was about to be released orchestrate the breakout from the outside. They would have to steal enough cash to finance it, get the guns necessary, and have a hideout waiting for them. They decided on Dillinger since his parole was coming up. He was brought into the fold and told that if he helped them break out, they would let him join their gang. Dillinger agreed. His one stipulation was that Jenkins got to go too. At first Pierpont refused, but then reluctantly agreed. As his parole was being processed, Dillinger was given a list of contacts on the outside and a number of banks to rob. After a few days of staying home, Dillinger routinely left the family farm and traveled to Indianapolis, where he got in touch with a Pierpont associate named Noble Claycomb, who in turn introduced him to a 19-year-old gunman William Shaw. Claycomb and Shaw were part of what was called the Whitecap Gang. During their robberies, each member wore a white cap and a pair of sunglasses. With these two, Dillinger pulled the second job of his life on June 4th. Though he thought the disguises were a bit childish, he wore them for the job. The target was the City Foods Incorporated grocery store in Indianapolis. Holcomb stayed in the car while Dillinger and Shaw, each armed with a handgun, went inside. Shaw robbed the place while Dillinger did crowd control. They got about $100. The following week Dillinger was back in Indianapolis and he, Shaw and another whitecap bandit named Paul Lefty Parker pulled 2 jobs on June 10th. First they hit a hog drug store. Parker was the driver while Shaw and Dillinger went inside. Afterwards, they hit another City Foods market. The paltry sums earned on these jobs wouldn't fund a jailbreak, and worse yet, they could easily send Dillinger back to the pen. Another bandit and Michigan City alumni, Harry Copeland, joined the gang around this time. About 7 years Dillinger's senior, the two probably knew each other on the inside, and Copeland caught up with him after his parole. One day prior to his 30th birthday, John Dillinger robbed his first bank. With 3 other men, possibly Copeland, Shaw, and Parker, Dillinger headed for the town of New Carlisle, Ohio on June 21st. Upon arrival, 3 of the bandits climbed through the window of the National Bank and waited for the employees to show up. The first was bookkeeper Horace Grisson, who arrived at 8:15. Once he entered, he found himself surrounded by 3 gunmen wearing handkerchiefs over their faces. They forced him to open the safe. Grabbing some loot, they found there was another locked compartment inside. The clerk played dumb and said he couldn't open the inside safe. He was tied up along with assistant cashier Mata Taylor, who had entered. After a bit the head cashier, Carl Enochs, arrived and he was forced to open the inner safe. Grabbing all the cash, the bandits fled out the back door and into the waiting car driven by a 4th man. They made a successful getaway with $10,500. 3 days later, they traveled to the town of Monticello, Indiana, with the aim of stealing the payroll from a textiles factory called the Thread Mills Company. This time things didn't work out for the bandits. At 10 a.m. on Saturday, June 24th, Dillinger and Shaw approached the facility. Dillinger went inside and saw an office to his immediate right where 2 women were stuffing cash into envelopes. Dillinger hurried outside and told Shaw to go in and pretend to ask for a job. When the office door was opened, he should draw his gun and slam the door shut. That would be the signal for Dillinger to enter. Shaw went in and knocked on the door. Instead of one of the women counting money, another woman from an office down the hall came to get him. Though it was a different office, Shaw drew his gun, announced it was a robbery, and slammed the door. However, it was too far away from the entrance and Dillinger didn't hear it. A manager grappled with Shaw and managed to wrestle the gun from his hand. The bandit fled from the building with the manager hot on his heels. As they jumped into the car, Dillinger took a pot shot at their pursuer and the bullet ricocheted off the sidewalk and hit him in the leg. Around July 8, the gang took an apartment in Muncie, Indiana where they planned to rob the bank in the nearby town of Daleville on July 15. Just after midnight on that day, Claycomb, Shaw and Parker dropped into the Bidewee Club, a local night spot, and, while Parker waited in the car, Claycomb and Shaw robbed the place of $70 before returning to the apartment. Witnesses got a good look at the car and police traced it back to their hideout. At about 9 that morning, Dillinger and Copeland pulled into the alley behind the apartment just in time to see their Confederates surrounded by cops with their hands up. Throwing the car into reverse, Dillinger was able to escape unnoticed. Once in custody, the bandits talked. The rest of the Whitecap gang was picked up in Indianapolis and police now knew that Dillinger was involved in the robberies. 2 days after his Confederates were arrested, Dillinger and Copeland walked into the Commercial Bank of Daleville. The only employee inside was bookkeeper Margaret Good. As Dillinger approached, she assumed he was a businessman. He asked to see the president, but Miss Good informed him that she was the only employee there. Dillinger pulled his gun out and said, "This is a stick-up. Get me the money, honey." With that, the bandit vaulted over the cage in swashbuckler fashion. Escorting Miss Good into the vault, he scooped up the cash. In the lobby, any customers who entered were corralled into the corner by Copeland. When Dillinger was finished, everyone was forced into the vault and the bandits made their dash for freedom. All in all, they got about $3,000 in cash and another $400 worth of jewelry that was in the vault. 2 days after the Daleville job, Dillinger, Copeland and their getaway driver struck again, but got little for their efforts. They attempted to rob the National Bank in Rockville, Indiana. The only people inside were the bank's president and his son. For some reason, however, perhaps because it was on a timer, they were unable to open the vault. They did, however, scoop $170 out of the teller's cash drawer. To add insult to injury, the president's son grabbed a gun and fired at them as they left. In between robberies, Dillinger was courting Mary Longacre, the sister of his prison chum James Jenkins. He had been infatuated with her since hearing about her back in Michigan City. When time allowed, he started making the trip to Dayton, Ohio to see her and fell for her in a big way. She was in the process of getting a divorce and he helped to finance it. Though her feelings for the bank robber weren't as strong, since he was going to break her brother out of prison, she went along with the relationship. On July 20th, flush with cash from the Daleville job, Dillinger took Mary and one of her friends to Chicago for a long weekend to visit the World's Fair. On the way home, they stopped by the penitentiary in Michigan City so Mary could visit her brother. Dillinger hid $50 and a banana for Jenkins to use to bribe guards. Mary also had a message for him and the others. "Hold tight." Afterwards, Dillinger wrote Mary a letter expressing his feelings for her and asked her to join him and Jenkins in South America after the prison break. She was noncommittal. After a leisurely weekend, it was back to work. On August 4th, Dillinger and Copeland entered the First National Bank of Montpelier, Indiana. Upon entering, Dillinger cordially stated, "This is a hold-up. All we want is the money." Copeland politely herded everyone into a rear room while Dillinger forced the bank president to escort him to the vault. The bandit scooped up a reported $10,000. Once everyone was safely locked away, the two robbers casually walked about a half block to the getaway car and the driver whisked them out of town. With the testimony of Shaw and Claycomb, and the statements of witnesses, Indiana State Police Captain Matt Leach knew that his state's newest bank robber du jour was John Dillinger and started his manhunt. August 14th, found Dillinger as part of a 5-man team that took $1,000 from the Citizens National Bank in Bluffton, Ohio. 2 men stayed in the car while 3 went inside. An alarm was tripped and this may have shortened their time in the bank. As the quintet fled town, one of the bandits blew out a store window with a blast from a machine gun to ward off any followers. This job would prove troublesome for Dillinger because the bank hired Pinkerton detectives to capture the robbers. By early September they learned that Dillinger was dating Mary Longacre and often visited her apartment in Dayton. This was confirmed by the landlady after being shown a picture of the bandit. Detectives began watching the boarding house. Now it was just a matter of time. Dillinger was busy though. He needed more money for the prison break, so visits to Mary had to be put off. On September 6, while a man waited at the wheel of the getaway car, Dillinger and an accomplice entered the State Bank in downtown Indianapolis. His partner handled crowd control while Dillinger grabbed the cash. Fortune smiled on them that day. Money for a payroll had just come in and the bandits left with over $20,000. It's believed that 6 days later, Dillinger took part in a bank robbery in Farrell, Pennsylvania near the Ohio border. This job consisted of 10 men in 2 cars. At about 11 a.m. they entered the bank and took about 10 grand. They also kidnapped a young man for safety, releasing him later in Youngstown, Ohio. If Dillinger was in on the job, he made the power drive back to Michigan City, Indiana, and, later that night, threw 3 packages of guns over the penitentiary wall. Pierpont and company were supposed to gather them the following morning, but another convict got there first and turned the firearms over to the warden. Word got back to Dillinger and a new plan was put into effect. He traveled to Chicago and procured more guns. Then he arranged to have them packed into a large crate of thread that was to be delivered to the shirt factory inside the prison where Pierpont and the other co-conspirators worked. They would know the box as it would be marked with an X. Dillinger had also gotten in touch with Mary Kinder, a longtime acquaintance of Harry Pierpont's, and since her brother was going to be one of those breaking out, she was tasked with finding an apartment for the gang for after the break. Dillinger told her that the earliest they would crash out would be September 27. With all things a go for the break, Dillinger decided to visit Mary Longacre and headed for Dayton. A little after midnight on September 22, detectives received a call from Mary's landlady. Dillinger was there. By 1:30 a.m. the house was surrounded and it was decided that 3 men would go in and get him. While one stood at the foot of the stairwell, 2 others, one armed with a shotgun, the other a machine gun, went up to Mary's second-story room with the landlady. They had her knock on the door and when it was opened they rushed in. Dillinger was standing in the middle of the room looking at photographs they had taken at the World's Fair. The detective with the shotgun yelled for him to stick 'em up. The bandit let the photos fall as he raised his hands. Then he started to slowly lower them. They went back up after the detective threatened to kill him. The day after Dillinger was captured, a large box of thread arrived at the prison storeroom. A convict named Walter Dietrich, who had since been taken into the escape plot, saw an X marked on it. He signed for it and retrieved the guns. The escape plan now included 10 inmates. There was the main group consisting of Harry Pierpont, Charles Mackley, Russell Clark and John Hamilton. Dillinger's best friend James Jenkins was included as promised. Brought in possibly due to necessity was Walter Dietrich, who signed for the guns, his bank-robbing accomplice James Clark, no relation to Russell. A young man named Ed Schaus, who in addition to being a criminal was a race car driver who Pierpont drafted into the gang as he thought he'd make a great getaway driver. And 2 others, Joseph Burns and Joseph Fox. Due to illness, Mary Kinder's brother would not be able to partake in the break. With the failed attempt from September 12, the convicts decided that they should go at the earliest opportunity lest the authorities catch wind of something. Swearing an oath to escape or die trying, it was decided that they would break out on September 26. After lunch that day, 9 of the men asked for passes to the infirmary. They met near the shirt factory and headed to the basement where they joined Dietrich, who produced the guns. Pierpont, Mackley and Hamilton were each given 1, and fake guns were handed out to the rest. Dietrich went upstairs and told the factory's superintendent that he was wanted in the basement. The official went downstairs and Hamilton stuck a gun in his back. Dietrich then went into the prison yard and informed the day captain that somebody inside needed to speak with him. The captain entered the building and Pierpont jammed a gun into his stomach and threatened to kill him if he tried anything. With the shop super and the day captain in tow, the convicts, carrying loads of shirts to cover their guns, walked single file through the prison yard. They made it to the front of the prison before being discovered, but all still made it out. Because the break was earlier than planned, there were no cars waiting for them and they had to fend for themselves. Dietrich, Fox, Burns and James Clark kidnapped a sheriff who was walking into the prison as they were coming out, and escaped in his car. Pierpont and the rest managed to escape despite a series of blunders. Later that night in Indianapolis, Mary Kinder was sitting in the family apartment when there was a knock at the door. She answered it and found Pierpont standing there. Out in a car were the rest of the escapees. Since she wasn't expecting them to bust out for a few days yet, she hadn't rented an apartment. Pierpont informed her that her brother was unable to make the break, but she still agreed to help them. A few days later, Harry Copeland appeared on the scene and said he had a place for them in Hamilton, Ohio, but it would take a few days. Despite Indiana State Police Captain Matt Leach's desire to have Dillinger brought to Indiana to face charges, Ohio decided to keep him and charge him for the Bluffton bank robbery. On September 28, Sheriff Jesse Sarber of Lima, Ohio, drove to Dayton to pick him up for the transfer back to the jail at Lima. Authorities were aware that the recent prison escapees might want to free Dillinger, so they took extra precaution in the transfer. The car containing Dillinger and Sarber was escorted by 2 other autos containing officers armed with shotguns and machine guns. As Dillinger was getting situated in Lima, Pierpont and the others were informed that their new Ohio hideout was ready. They stole a car for the trip. Police quickly learned of the auto theft and roadblocks started to go up. Police officers in an armored car saw them pull up and do a U-turn, and the chase was on. While taking a turn at about 80 miles per hour, the back door to the convict sedan opened and Jenkins fell out. Unable or unwilling to stop, his comrades left him. Pierpont and the others successfully evaded capture and made it to their new hideout. Things didn't work out so well for Jenkins. He kidnapped a young driver and told him to take him to Nashville. Running low on gas, they pulled into a filling station, and as Jenkins tried to get an attendant, the driver sped off, leaving the outlaw stranded. The guy went to the police and identified a picture of Jenkins as his abductor. Soon the region knew that one of the escapees was in the area. As a man was driving into the nearby hamlet of Bean Blossom, Indiana, he saw Jenkins walking towards town and alerted some locals. Grabbing their guns, they went to investigate. As Jenkins entered town, 3 vigilantes, one armed with a double-barrel shotgun, approached him. Jenkins told them that his car had broke down and he wanted to buy some parts. The men told him that, just to be safe, they were going to frisk him. At this, Jenkins drew a .45 and shot one of the men in the shoulder. The man with the shotgun let him have it in the head with both barrels. There would be no trip to South America with Johnny. In need of funds, the Pierpont gang decided to rob a bank. Mackley suggested the one in his hometown of St. Mary's there in Ohio. Copeland claimed that he was too ill to take part, so Mary Kinder drove a second getaway car. She waited outside of town as the job was pulled. Pierpont and Mackley went inside while Hamilton and Clark stood guard out front. Behind the wheel was Schaus. Pierpont and Mackley managed to get about 11 grand and a successful escape was made, although, it being his hometown, Mackley was recognized. Flush with cash, it was time to free their pal from jail. On October 12, the escapees traveled to Lima, Ohio in 2 cars to free their pal. At almost 6:30, Pierpont, Mackley and Clark entered the sheriff's house, which also doubled as the county jail. Waiting at the wheel of one of the getaway cars was Schaus. Down the street, Hamilton stood at the ready outside a movie theater. Standing guard over both cars was Harry Copeland. Inside the house, the sheriff, his wife and a deputy had just finished dinner. The sheriff sat at his desk reading the paper. His gun in a drawer. The deputy's gun belt sat on another desk as he relaxed on a davenport. To the left of the sheriff's desk was the door leading to the cells. Inside, Dillinger sat at a table playing pinochle with 4 other inmates. The trio of gunmen entered the office. Sheriff Sarber asked them what they wanted. Pierpont told him that they were officers from Michigan City and that they wanted to see Dillinger. "Let me see your credentials," the sheriff asked. "Here's our credentials," Pierpont responded, pulling out his pistol. "You can't do that," Sheriff Sarber responded, reaching for his desk drawer. Pierpont pulled his trigger and the sheriff fell to the floor. Inside the cell block, at the sound of the shot, one of Dillinger's card partners said, "John, your gang is after you." With that, Dillinger leapt over the table and grabbed his coat and hat. Back in the office, Pierpont demanded the keys to the cells, but Sarber just tried to rise, at which point Mackley smacked him across the head with his gun. He still didn't offer the keys, so Pierpont raised his gun. "Don't kill him!" Clark cried. Pierpont too brought his gun down on the sheriff's skull. At this, Mrs. Sarber yelled for them to stop hurting her husband and got the keys. Pierpont opened the cell block door. Dillinger came up and Pierpont handed him a gun. Walking into the office, he knelt by the sheriff to inspect him. Then he left. Mackley locked Mrs. Sarber and the deputy in a cell before making their getaway. The sheriff's son happened to show up a few minutes later. He got his father to the hospital, but unfortunately the sheriff died a short time later. After the breakout, panic swept Ohio and Indiana. A large group of well-armed, murderous desperados were on the loose. The question wasn't, will they strike? The question was where and when. With things so hot in the Buckeye State, the gang decided to break into a couple of groups and reconvene in Chicago. On the way, Dillinger and two others stopped off in the small Indiana town of Auburn and pulled up to the police department. Only one officer was on duty when three armed men entered. He was placed in a cell while the bandits helped themselves to the arsenal. They took a machine gun, a couple of rifles, and numerous handguns. They repeated this less than a week later on October 20th, when they ventured back into Indiana and paid a visit to the Peru Police Department. Three officers were lounging in the station when suddenly Pierpont appeared with a Thompson, followed by Dillinger, who held a pistol. As his cohort kept the policemen covered, Dillinger made a few trips back and forth to the car, carrying out another Thompson, a couple of sawed-off shotguns, bulletproof vests and ammunition. The officers were then locked in a cell as the desperados made their getaway. Now that they were sufficiently armed, the gang got to business. Their first target, the Central National Bank of Greencastle, Indiana. Years before, Pierpont had worked at a nearby gravel yard and knew the area well. A little before 3 p.m. on October 23, the bandits pulled up outside the bank. Dillinger, Pierpont and Mackley entered the building while Hamilton stood outside the door making sure nobody came or went. Pierpont approached the teller and asked for change of a 20. At this point, Dillinger pulled his gun and announced that it was a robbery. Just as he did the previous summer, the athletic bank robber jumped over the counter in a show of theatrics. The bandits managed to get nearly $75,000 in cash and bonds and successfully made it back to their apartments in Chicago. While celebrating their success, Pierpont and Mackley kidded Dillinger about his showboating gymnastics display. Wanting to prove that he was a professional like the rest of them, he never made another leap. By working with Chicago detectives and Windy City stool pigeons, Indiana State Police Captain Matt Leach learned that Dillinger had an appointment with a Windy City doctor on November 15. The plan was that after the bank robber left the doctor's office and got into his car, 4 other cars would box him in and they would simply shoot him to death. 3 cars containing Chicago detectives and 1 with Indiana officers pulled up to the doctor's office and saw Dillinger's Essex Terraplane parked out front. In the front seat sat Dillinger's new girlfriend Billy Freshett. After a while Dillinger stepped out of the office building. Sensing something wasn't right, he nonchalantly looked down the street and saw 2 cars parked in the opposite direction facing his own. He correctly assumed there was a trap waiting for him. Climbing into his car, he told Billy to hang on. Instead of driving forward as the police were anticipating, he slammed it into reverse and swung out into traffic. He was speeding away before the police had time to react. One of the cars managed to pursue, however. As they raced through the streets, Dillinger's rear window was blown out by a shotgun blast. Shots from a .38 slammed into his door as the police car pulled closer. At one point, a beat cop, assuming that the unmarked police car was actually a carload of gangsters attempting a murder, opened fire on the carload of detectives. After a few miles, Dillinger managed to lose them. Despite the close call with the police, business had to go on and the gang chose November 20th as the date of their next job. For this one, they would be heading into new territory. The target this time was the American Bank and Trust Company in Racine, Wisconsin. However, there was some internal business that needed clearing up. Harry Copeland was drinking heavily, which was a deal-breaker for Pierpont and the rest. A few beers was fine, but sobriety was the order of the day. Also, Ed Schaus was making a play for Dillinger's girl Billy and she was showing interest in him. Another strike against Schaus was that Mary Kinder overheard him trying to talk John Hamilton into doing a bank job themselves so they didn't have to share the proceeds with the rest of the gang. That was the final straw for Schaus. They gave him some money and told him to leave, which he did. The problem with Copeland solved itself the day before the robbery. Early in the morning he was arguing with a woman in his car and started waving his gun around. Some bystanders saw it and called the cops and he was arrested. Though he gave a fictitious name, fingerprints don't lie. Once they realized they had Copeland, police set up a cordon around the station house consisting of machine gunners and shotgun-wielding guards to prevent any repeats of Lima. They needn't have bothered. His Confederates were glad to be rid of him, as Copeland was being transferred back to Indiana. At 2:30 in the afternoon in Racine, the gang went to work. Pierpont entered the bank first, followed by Mackley, then Dillinger, then Hamilton. Clark was out back with the car. Things didn't go as easy this time. Mackley, armed with a Thompson, accidentally shot a bank clerk, who hit a silent alarm after falling. The two cops who responded to the call assumed that it was a false alarm and weren't prepared for what was happening inside. One of them was carrying a machine gun and Mackley shot him. The officer dropped with a superficial injury. With all the shooting, dozens of people started to gather outside the bank. Once the cash had been gathered, the desperados grabbed some bank employees to use as human shields and made their way outside. Pushing through the crowds, they made their way around the corner. Pierpont saw two armed cops running across the street. He yelled to Mackley, who let out a burst from his Thompson. Store windows shattered as the cops ran for cover. With both Schaus and Copeland gone, Dillinger became the wheelman. With their hostages guaranteeing nobody would shoot at them, he successfully made the getaway. When the gang had gone a safe distance, the two remaining hostages were released. The job netted them about $28,000 in cash and bonds. About 3 weeks later, on December 14th, Chicago police received a tip that the Dillinger gang had a car being fixed at a local garage. Sergeant William Shanley and two others were sent to investigate. At around 4 p.m. Hamilton showed up and, when confronted by Shanley, drew a gun and fatally shot the detective before escaping on foot. With the death of Shanley, Chicago authorities ordered Captain John Steege to create a squad of 40 detectives whose sole purpose was to bring down the Dillinger gang. Since they were responsible for the murders of two lawmen, Steege wasn't so much interested in capturing the gang as he was in simply killing them. The order was to shoot first and shoot to kill. With the two close calls in Chicago, all the gang members attempted to change their looks. Each of them dyed their hair and Dillinger started to grow a mustache. Deciding things were too hot in the Windy City, they split up for a bit and went their separate ways. On Tuesday, December 19th, Indiana State Police Captain Matt Leach received word that former gang member Ed Schaus would be showing up at the Hotel France in the town of Paris, Illinois. On the morning of the 21st, Leach and his men, in conjunction with their Illinois counterparts and local Paris lawmen, devised a trap. Much like the one in Chicago that failed to catch Dillinger. Cars containing various officers would be parked in front of the hotel. When the bandit pulled up, he would be boxed in from both the front and rear. After waiting about 4 hours, Schaus pulled up in front of the hotel, with two women in the front seat. Before he knew what was what, a car pulled up and smashed into the front of his car. Two others came up from behind. The shoot-first philosophy may have cost the life of one of the officers. From the front car, Officer Eugene McTeague jumped out with a gun drawn and approached the passenger side of Schaus's auto. As he was doing so, one of his fellow officers, who was stationed inside the hotel lobby, came running out. Either assuming McTeague was the bandit or simply because he was overexcited, he pulled his trigger and sent a bullet through the back of McTeague's head. Schaus climbed out of the car with hands raised and was taken without trouble. Interestingly, while in custody, Schaus opened up about his former Confederates. He stated that he left the gang on his own accord on November 18, because they were kill crazy. "If you policemen are married men with families," he told authorities, "I warn you to be careful about trying to take the other members of the gang." Adding, every night they have a drill and each takes the position assigned to him in the event police surprise them. He also mentioned that the plan was to amass $100,000 and flee to South America. Apparently Dillinger's dream of going south of the border with Jenkins had caught on with his new pals, and they set that as their goal. That night in Chicago, Captain John Steege and his Dillinger squad were acting on their own tip. Earlier they learned that members of the Dillinger gang could be found in a North Side apartment. Assigned with going in was Sergeant Frank Reynolds, who relished taking out bad guys and already had a dozen notches on his gun. He was hoping to add Dillinger and his Confederates to his list of kills. The tipster stated that the gang was expecting a visit from an underworld associate known as Mule. At about 9 that evening, Reynolds and 2 others rang the bell for the apartment. The detective announced that he was Mule and was told to come up. The trio went to the second floor rooms and Reynolds knocked. The door was opened and the detective burst in with his gun blazing. He shot the first man he saw, who was sitting on the couch. Though hit, the man got up and tried to hide but fell with 2 more bullets in him. Another guy who was sitting nearby stood up and opened fire on Reynolds. The detective killed him with 2 shots. Reynolds' associates managed to wound the third man in the room. As the gunman wriggled about, Reynolds, who was out of bullets, drew a .38 from his coat pocket and finished the guy off with a shot to the head. After the smoke cleared, they realized that the men killed weren't the Dillinger gang, but 3 other denizens of the underworld. Although the wrong outlaws were dead, attitudes of the times were that Chicago was rid of 3 hoodlums. While Indiana's Matt Leach and Chicago's Dillinger squad were assiduously searching for the desperados, the gang itself headed for warmer climes. 2 days before Christmas, Dillinger and Billy pulled up to a large beach house in Daytona Beach, Florida. They were greeted by Clark, Mackley, and Hamilton. The holiday took a bad turn when Dillinger and Billy got into a fight on Christmas Eve. The bandit felt that his girlfriend was still harboring feelings for Schaus. The next morning he blackened both of her eyes, gave her $1,000 and sent her home. Pierpont and Mary showed up that Christmas morning, and after Billy left, they all exchanged gifts. A week later, on New Year's Eve, Dillinger heard fireworks going off at midnight. To join the celebration, he stepped out onto the porch with a Thompson and fired off some rounds over the ocean. It was his first New Year's since 1923 that he wasn't behind bars. One can only guess what was going through his head as he looked out over the dark ocean. His predicament had to weigh on him. On some level he had to know that either through incarceration or police bullets, this was his final New Year's, and if the wiping out of the 3 hoodlums by the Dillinger squad was any indication, it would be the latter. One thing that Dillinger couldn't have conceived was that in the coming months, his criminal exploits would catapult him into the history books and he would supplant Jesse James as America's most infamous outlaw. But as 1933 passed into 1934, he, Pierpont, Hamilton, Clark and Mackley were free. The fantasy of making big scores and fleeing to South America where they could while away their lives in peaceful obscurity fueling their ambition. If they could continue to stay one step ahead of the law, they just might be able to pull it off. Of course, it was all a pipe dream. There would be no South America. Within 10 months all but one of them would be dead. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and consider subscribing. If you would like to support the channel, there is a PayPal link in the description.